Okay, people, hope you're all well. So, this video relates to history and imperialism and diplomacy. And I think it's an issue that we're going to hear about again in the near future, no doubt as trade talks come up and bilateral relations are examined between India and the UK. So I'm just going to show you the front cover of the Daily Telegraph from the other day, Saturday the 13th of May. Curiously, it was cheaper than the Times. The weekend edition was cheaper than the Times. It's usually the other way around. But I got this. Well, I'm saying that's £4 maybe. The prices are going up and everything. But anyway, it's a historic edition. It was worth getting. Cover. So as you can see, there's the portrait of the king and his immediate heirs, William and George. A great regal picture. But if you could see beside that, the lead article is on this. India to demand return of colonial treasures. Okay, now I'm not going to read out the whole report here because there's quite a lot of analysis, but it makes for interesting reading. Basically, the situation is that diplomatic staff in New Delhi are preparing, on the wishes of Narendra Modi, to initiate sweeping repatriation claims for artifacts. Now, apparently, on Modi's watch, there's already been quite a number of artifacts that were taken by the British East India Company in the days of the Raj. I believe that 300 have already returned, and that's significantly more than the entire period from independence until 2014 when Modi came to power. So it's very clear that Modi is making this a big, big part of his agenda. Now, I personally don't particularly trust Narendra Modi. I don't particularly like him. I think he's a nationalistic demagogue. I think he has dictatorial tendencies. Clearly, he's very thin-skinned, as shown by their legal threats against the BBC for the documentary made earlier this year. And to be fair, there's been, extensive debate within India about that, about free speech and about Modi's grip on power. Now, India is due for a general election, I believe, next year, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think, unless I'm mistaken, Indian prime ministers are term limited to 2 4-year terms, or 2 5-year terms, excuse me, but I might be wrong about that. Perhaps any Indian viewers can clarify that matter. Um, before we get into this, before we get into some of the nitty gritty of this issue, just to put my cards on the table here. Yes, I'm British. Yes, I'm patriotic. And yes, I feel that some of this has cynical motivations. But this doesn't mean that I'm an apologist for everything that was done under empire. And fundamentally, the principle of it is this stuff, most of it belongs in India, right? It's their cultural heritage. And let's be honest, we took it. Okay, I don't think it makes you woke or revisionist to accept that this was exploitation was part of empire. And even if this wasn't done by sort of looting in every case, in some cases it was sold. There probably was a lot of coercion there from London. We have to be honest about that. And I do get the Indian sentiment on this. I get that some of the most treasured artifacts in their history, and it's a very long history, going back to the Indus Valley civilization, belongs in a European former colonial power, thousands of miles away. That's humiliating. And I think there probably is some legitimate resentment over that. I mean, I suppose if we were to make an equivalence, it would be like, the stones of Stonehenge or some of those Bronze Age sites around London, Bronze Age hoards being taken to an Asian country and, kept in their museums. We'd probably resent it. So, looking at the Indian perspective, I do understand that. However, this is not a black and white issue. For one thing, one of the key demands is for the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which I understand is part of the crown jewels. In fact, it's embedded, unless I'm mistaken, in not the St Edward's crown, I think it's Queen Mary crown, unless I'm mistaken. Regardless, it's in one of the 105. Let me just read this out. The 105 carat Koh-i-Noor diamond once topped the Mughal emperor's peacock throne. It was held by Indian rulers before being handed to the East India Company and then given to Queen Victoria after the annexation of the Punjab. That was actually given by teenage Maharaja, I believe, in a deal, but there was coercion involved. I mean, it's not as clear cut as the British just went in and took it, but it was from imperialistic coercion. That's true. The jewellers adorned Queen Mary's crown. It was Queen Mary's crown, but was not displayed in the coronation last week. Interesting. That's interesting. So when they crowned Camilla, that was Queen Mary's crown. I don't know if they took it out for that, or maybe they felt it would be too diplomatically risky to have it at the coronation itself. But regardless, it's in the crown jewels of the United Kingdom, and it's one of the key things. Now, the thing with the Koh-i-Noor diamond, actually, its origins are uncertain, and some of the other crown jewels are uncertain. I mean, here's the problem: some of the things that India may be demanding actually could have other claimants as well. Because often with diamonds, there is a little bit of obscure background whereby they pass over ownership throughout the centuries. And Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, they may all make claims on some of these things that India is currently claiming, in which case it gets into a real diplomatic standoff there. Now, I do think at least some of this will be Modi trying to distract from domestic problems. Um, India recently surpassed China as the world's most populous country. A country as big as that, with 1.4 billion people, is always going to have huge challenges. But recently, there was more sectarian violence in the state of Manipur, I believe. Dozens killed. I would say that's a bigger priority for the Indian Prime Minister than this sort of settling scores with a former colonial power. I'm not saying it's not important, but I do suspect it's a distraction, at least in part. Why? Because there's a growing middle class in India. They're conscientious. They're proud of their history, and Modi is no doubt pitching to them and playing this up a lot. No doubt for his own popularity ratings. Now, politically, it makes sense. If I was Modi, I would probably do the same thing. It makes total sense. But my question is it the priority with the sort of growing sectarian tensions that India is facing? Right now, there are very legitimate concerns from Indian Christians, Indian Muslims, and frankly, Indian atheists as well over what direction this Hindutva fundamentalism is growing. I do think that Modi is a wannabe dictator. I think he's kind of the Donald Trump of India. Or maybe we could say Donald Trump is the Narendra Modi of America. There is a real blood and soil nationalism, I think, to Modi's worldview. And if we look at India's stance on Ukraine, now I'm talking about this because it gets into the wider issue of Anglo-Indian relations. If we look at Modi's stance on Ukraine, basically sitting on the fence, abstaining from UN votes, what happens the next time India and Pakistan go to war? Or even if there's a violent border clash between India and China, New Delhi will no doubt pitch for international support. Um, we obviously have very strained relations to China, but frankly, our relations with India are not ideal. Better than China, but not. It's not, I would say, a great relationship. It's workable. There's no major strains, but I do feel that every time, basically, New Delhi wants to push his weight a little bit, it will use colonial guilt, or at least try to push that colonial guilt. And you see this in NDTV and We On News, and frankly, this irritates me. They definitely play up the nationalism. I remember when Sunak became Prime Minister last year, some of the headlines were absurd. A son of India rises over the empire. Well, Sunak was born in Southampton, and the British Empire's gone. So it's a redundant, very sensationalistic sort of headline. I don't have much time for Way On News. I think that they are. I think there's quite a lot of dumbing down of their journalism. I think they're very sensationalistic. They're a bit like Fox News. They're very, very nationalistic as well, and I think quite anti-British. I do think among Indian nationalists there is still I know better than to say a chip on the shoulder because that's got me in hot water before when people have said that's not the situation. But I do think there is a bit of, we need to show the British we're now a rising superpower. And that's true. I mean, India has just surpassed the UK in GDP. So I think there's a legitimate question: should we really be sending millions and millions and millions in aid to a country that now has its own space program and that is actually bigger than us in GDP? I think as soon as a country gets bigger than us in GDP level, I think it's valid that we review just how much we're giving them. Now, we have to be honest, India does give the UK something. Their contributions, for example, to the NHS, Indian doctors, work very hard. They literally save British lives. So it shouldn't be a case of looking at this in a very black and white way. Both countries have vested interests. But what I do resent about New Delhi's approach is it always uses this angle of colonial guilt to conduct foreign policy. My point about that would be India's been an independent country for 75 years. So is it going to do this forever? Every time there is some dispute between New Delhi and London, let's say a British national is in trouble in India, are they just going to use, we're not going to give the former colonial power what it wants and always use this narrative? Which I think they do, and I've got a problem with that. But it's not a black and white thing of simply handing all of this stuff over. Partly there is some of the dubious origins to begin with, but even, the things that are certainly of Indian origin, actually there's legal issues around this because the British government's position is that this is ultimately down to the decision of individual museums. Now, in order for that to change, in other words, the museums are actually legally bound to keep their collections together. Um, and the government's holding back from changing the law on that in order to, appease these demands. I'll be honest, I think we probably can give a bit of ground. I think if we just point blank refuse, that's probably wrong. And I think it wouldn't be very practical from our point of view or from our perception. It would just look like the arrogant British, not giving back what belongs to us. But the Indian side, they will be pushing this and pushing this, and it's going to affect, for example, even visa waivers for Indian businesses or Indian students studying in the UK, things like that. It could affect a lot of things. I think we would be wrong to, at a time when we've got very strained relations with China, to put up barriers for the sake of it. I think India itself knows that this is not something that they want to. The report in the Daily Telegraph, if you just bear with me a second, I'm not reading out the whole thing because it's quite long. The report in the Daily Telegraph states, however, while many who spoke to the Telegraph said they did not want to poke the UK in the eye or seek an antagonistic relationship in which diplomacy becomes bogged down in bartering for cultural artifacts, the economic might of India and its close historic and demographic ties to the UK may give it an advantage over other nations who ask but never get, i.e., Greece and the Elgin Marbles. Mr. Modi may ultimately be handed more of a chance to undo that history written by foreigners. This is referring to a poem that was written by Rabindranath Tagore in 1903. That the history of India, written by foreigners, Indians themselves feature no more than dust and storm. Um, so the way this would be redressed is if the law was changed to basically allow museums to part with some of those artifacts. There is a legitimate concern about collections being kept together. For one reason, there have been cases where artifacts have been returned, I'm not saying to India, but to other countries, and they've ended up getting looted or sold into private, tycoons' hands rather than given to the people of that country. I think this was the case with Nigeria. Germany, the German Foreign Ministry has recently had an issue with that because they handed over artifacts to Nigeria that they thought were going to be for the Nigerian nation and ended up being in the hands of private individuals. Um, and you get a situation where there are unstable parts of the world, particularly countries in the Middle East. If artifacts are handed back, and then you get the likes of ISIS taking over, what does ISIS do? They destroy these artifacts for idolatry. In other words, there is an argument to be made that when these artifacts are in European cities, they're far safer. Now, I don't think that's the case with India. India is not Syria, clearly, but I'm just making the wider point that that can be an issue. This is some of the things that are being claimed by New Delhi. The pictures. Tipu's tiger, it depicts a Bengal tiger savaging a British officer. It's a mechanical artifact. Buddha's footprints, the statue of Shiva, the Maharaja Ranjit Singh's throne. These are beautiful artifacts. Tiger's head finial, and Lord Hara Hara idol. I hope my pronunciation's okay. So, these are priceless artifacts. I don't blame India for wanting them back, quite honestly. They are beautiful artifacts. But, there is, again, some of the narrative is misleading. For example, often Indian nationals speak about pre-Raj India as if it was one political entity, as if there was a single nation state of India. The truth is, India, like China, has been racked by internal civil wars, by foreign invasions, by a very, very turbulent and violent history. And pre 1857, India was not a unified state. There were princely states that were largely independent. So it's a bit misleading to talk about, the pre-Raj era being one unified, happy India, because it wasn't. Um, and it's also misleading to suggest that pre-British India was this utopian land where everyone got on with each other. It's one of the big issues I would have with revisionism and the talking about this legacy of empire, which is this notion that before European empires arrived, and this could be true of the Spanish or the Portuguese or the Dutch, that there was this harmonious situation in occupied lands. That's not true. That's not to justify imperialism. It's not to justify what Europeans done, but let's just not oversimplify history. Um, let's see. Tipu Sultan, India. Let me just read this little piece out. Diplomats were clear to stress that this wasn't sectarian. It's not to sort of promote a Hindu nationalism. India is also seeking the treasures of Tipu Sultan, a Muslim foe of the East India Company who was killed and his palace looted in the 1799 siege. In our 1799 siege, a hoard of his treasures rests in Powys Castle in Wales, a National Trust property, while his mechanical tiger, shown biting into a mechanical British soldier, is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Um, Officials in Athens have grown frustrated with this stalemate. That's the issue with the legal situation regarding museums keeping their pieces together. Um, the Tristram Hunt, the Victoria and Albert director, that's a former Tory MP, former TV presenter as well, has voiced his support for repatriation in the past, but his insulation is bound by law to keep its collection intact. I'm just going to read out some of the other claims from other countries. The Elgin Marbles, this is, of course is famous. The Greek government wants to reclaim 5th century BC sculptures removed from the Parthenon in Athens by Lord Elgin in the early 19th century. They are held in the British Museum, which is unable to give objects away under UK law, leading to a stalemate that its chairman George Osborne, the former Chancellor, is trying to resolve. Well, the only way that changes is a change in the law to allow museums to break up their collection for this purpose. But I've heard one of the opposing arguments is if artifacts were just sent all over the world to their country of origin, then there would be no place where people could see all the world's treasures together. That's one of the arguments against it. The Benin bronzes. The objects were made for the rulers of Benin, a kingdom incorporated into modern-day Nigeria, not to be confused with the Republic of Benin. See here, and taken by British forces during a raid in 1897. Nigeria has lobbied for the return successfully, and Germany's museums and the Ashmolean and Fitzwilliam museums in the UK are pledging to return their collections. But again, they're pledging return, but can they legally do that? Ethiopians' tabots. These are sacred in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Several of these representations of the tablets of Mosaic law were seized by the British after the Battle of Magdala. Some are held in the British Museum where no one is allowed to look at or touch them, as only Orthodox priests are allowed to do so. The fact that these are sacred and not being used for anything has led to calls for the return, including from Lord Carey of Clifton, that's the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah. Now, if they're not on public display, maybe that's an example where we should just return them if there was a guarantee of their security in Ethiopia. But again, Ethiopia has been racked by war in recent years, so the Ethiopians would. I mean, I suppose the argument we made, it's their treasures, so if it did ultimately get looted or destroyed, that's their responsibility. Cambodian artifacts. The government of Cambodia has begun to seek out artifacts trafficked out of the country during the chaos and bloodshed of the Khmer Rouge era. Many are thought to be sold by Douglas Latchford, a deceased British art dealer and smuggler. Sounds like a shifty character. Cambodian experts travelled to the UK in 2022 to inspect several collections, including that held by the British Museum, to match objects to descriptions given by smugglers of what they admit stealing. Okay, I'm just going to summarise this. Clearly, even if it is being used by Modi to distract from domestic problems like the sectarian issues that are very much in India at the moment, clearly it's going to rumble on. And I think certainly in some cases we should swallow our pride and probably just return artifacts, including India. I think we should, I don't think it's a fight really worth having in terms of, even if it is being done for India's nationalistic reasons, I think some of those artifacts probably should just be returned. All of them, I can't see a situation where every single one returns, because some of them are going to have dubious backgrounds, and I think there might be rival claims from Afghanistan, which is currently under the Taliban. They can hardly be trusted to safeguard ancient artifacts, and Iran and Pakistan. Um, I think in cases where artifacts have clearly Indian origin, particularly those of Bronze Age cultures and the Indus Valley civilization, probably we should swallow our pride, change the law, and return some of it. I don't think that would be weakness on the part of Sunak or the British side. I think it's just showing that we're mature enough to recognise, yeah, we are not arrogant about empire. We recognise this was taken and it belongs to India, ultimately. So I think we can do that. However, in terms of the wider Anglo-Indian relations, I do think we should be a little bit wary of New Delhi constantly using colonial guilt to get what it wants. And I do think there are legitimate questions. I'm talking here more broadly about Anglo-Indian relations, about foreign aid. I think there's a case to be made of at least reducing the amount of aid that is sent to a country that has its own kids program. And I think that when the likes of WeOn and NDTV make kind of, well, basically when they demonise Britain and the British, I think we should make diplomatic overtures to show New Delhi that actually this worked both ways. We're not entirely happy with everything as well. Because basically, I mean, you can imagine if the BBC made a report vilifying Indians, the Indian embassy would be up in arms. So when you have an Indian broadcaster, like We On News, basically vilifying the British as they regularly do, and I mean, I think it's pretty xenophobic in their approach. They talk about, I remember when there was some football hooliganism over the UEFA Cup final, it didn't even have anything to do with India. But they were saying that this is the behaviour of the English, as if it was all, as if the behaviour of some hooligans represents the entire nation of England. They were using that as a way to basically attack the English. I think that there is quite a lot of racism and xenophobia in India. And I think, when they are pointing fingers at about colonial skills, frankly, I want to say, well, look at your own backyard. Look at what's happening on Modi's watch. I think India has become quite an intolerant place on his watch. Then this is not to vilify India. I think India is a great nation, but I think its potential is being ruined by its demagoguery and by Hindutva extremism. A few years ago, a film was going to be broadcast in UK cinemas, and they actually got bomb threats from Hindu fundamentalists because it depicted a taboo kissing scene. So basically, I'll summarise this. I think probably we should, on this issue, I don't think we really gain anything by being too stubborn about it and not changing the law. But I also think we should be careful not to conduct foreign policy with India or diplomatic ties with India solely through this prism of guilt. And if New Delhi thinks it can just barter that way, I think we need to make it clear that's not how we're going to conduct foreign policy. We want mutually respectful relations. We want a good relationship with India, but it can't be conducted through this prism of, well, give us what we want, or otherwise we'll remind you of the wrongs of empire. Decades ago. At this point, 75 years on. Actually, 47, 76 years on. Basically, I don't think India can use the empire forever as a bartering tool because it's been an independent country for 76 years. And some very bad things have happened during that period of independence that are at the hands of the Indian government. So I do feel that nationalists and demagogues you see this in Africa as well, they use the wrongs of European colonialism to kind of, I don't want to say blackmail, but that's the wrong word, but barter and to basically browbeat in order to get what they want. So yeah, I think we can give some ground. I think we could definitely return some of these artifacts as a goodwill gesture, and because it's the right thing to do ultimately. But I also feel that we shouldn't be browbeaten by New Delhi every time they make demands, because after all, if we have some ongoing situations. There was a case I highlighted not long ago. A British national who's also of Indian descent has been held for years in prison without a trial. Um, his innocence is seriously being questioned. So his guilt rather is seriously being questioned. Situations like that, when it comes to those sort of negotiations, something like returning these artifacts might actually help us. So I think for a goodwill gesture and diplomatic gesture, probably we could return a good number of these artifacts. But it shouldn't be because of Modi's political ambitions, and it shouldn't be to kowtow to Narendra Modi. I don't much like the man. I think he's a demagogue. I think he's quite dangerous for Indian democracy, and I hope if he does have another term viability, I hope he's defeated because I think he's bad for India. Um, I think his nationalism and sectarianism is affecting Indian democracy. That's my thoughts. What do you think? I would like to hear Indian perspectives, and I hope you don't just come in and say, "Oh, you're British, or you've got colonialist arrogance or something." I'm saying we should probably return most of these.